Let's talk about policy and procedure. My name is Anthony Gangi. Welcome to the show, Tier Talk. As you can see, I got the new intro, so it kind of tells you where you can find the show. Soon to be on the Manhattan Neighborhood Network, so if you live in the 5 boroughs, guys, that's your show. It's right on Vios, and if you don't live in the 5 boroughs, you can still stream it live from their website. So today I want to talk about policy and procedure. It's definitely a needed discussion because policy and procedure is what's going to protect your career. So today my guest is Gary York. He's a retired inspector from the Florida Department of Corrections. He's also an author. He wrote books like Corruption Behind Bars and Inside the Inner Circle. And I want to discuss the importance of policy and procedure. So Gary, welcome back as always.
Thank you very much, Anthony. I appreciate you having me back.
Now, Gary, how important is policy and procedure?
Well, contrary to what some of the people out there believe, policy and procedure is necessary not only for the success of the agency, but for everyone involved. And policy and procedure is not put in place to harm anyone. It's to protect everyone. And in the correctional setting, the policy and procedure protects not only the staff members, but it protects the inmates and anyone else who works within the prison.
Right, and people that are in management and frontline, you got to listen to this because policy and procedure is the lifeblood of the facility. Okay, that means that, you know, on the successes and failures, these policies and procedures are built on. So if you're in management, you can't always look at policies and procedures as being set in stone. Sometimes sometimes there's certain situations as defined by human behavior that there's not a policy for. So later on, kind of retroactive, we try to get the best and worst of what happened, and we try to devise a policy that highlights the best and what should be done. So for management, again, you may have policy and procedure, but if something happens in the facility, the individual on the front line who's going through it at that time, if that person understands policy and procedure and tries to explain to you from that point why policy and procedure did not work and what should be done, you should be open to listen to that conversation. Correct, Gary?
Correct, because, you know, policy and procedure, as you said, is not set in stone, so we always try to ask management, please use common sense also, because policy and procedure is mainly to ensure consistency. Now, in the correction setting, things are different every day, and policy and procedure is a guideline, and a guideline is to try to keep things consistent among all the staff. However, when things go awry, such as a suicide attempt, an attack on an officer, anything of that nature, the consistency may go out the window, and some other maneuver or technique may have to be used. So we hope that management looks at the situation, looks at each incident separately, and decides whether or not the officer did the correct thing, and not use the policy and procedure in the opposite manner to try and burn the officer. But let's try to find out why the officer did what he did or she did, and let's be a little flexible with our policy and procedure.
Right, and as mentioned, if you're the officer going through it or being investigated, you need to know the original policy, because you're going to have to explain why you had to make a left or a right. And that's the key. I think that when I'm always open to conversation or dialogue is if there was a concern with policy. And then when there's a concern with policy, the person defending their position, in my mind, would have to start from, okay, policy says this, and this. But because this happened, I wind up having to do this, and this. It's a great way to show somebody, okay, listen, I understand what policy says. I know it tells us to do this, but in the meantime, this is why I had to do this, and this is what management needs to hear. They need to hear that. But that's why a lot of people in front line prefer people with experience, because when you're dealing in corrections and you're working with you're dealing with a lot of unique individuals, but most importantly, the human behavior aspect of it all, it can't be all predicted. So there's going to be a lot of gray. And the thing is, the reason why you need to know policy is because if you know policy when you're scrambling in the gray, you at least know where you have to go. It's just a matter of getting it back to that policy. But when you don't know the policy, when you don't know what the proper procedure is, the gray becomes a lot harder to navigate because you don't have a direction and you don't know where you're headed. And Gary, when you're an investigator or an inspector, the first thing you're going to check departmentally was policy followed, correct?
Well, that's a very good point, because when we do our investigative reports, we're going to have three things we look at. Was there a criminal violation? So that would be your state statute. We look at that. Was there an administrative violation? So then we're going to go to the policy and procedures, which in Florida, that's the Florida Administrative Code. We call it the Bible, Title 33, Department Administrative Rules. And we're going to see if any of the administrative codes or policies and procedures were violated, not to try and find the officer guilty, but to find out if there was one violated. And then if we find the administrative code that goes with that certain incident, we still have to look at each situation separately, as I mentioned before, and decide whether or not there was reason that there was a variance from the policy.
Right.
Not every time does somebody have to be guilty. Each incident has its own scenario, and it's very important to look at each incident separately and have an open mind when doing these investigations. And as an inspector, you also work with the warden, and you also work with your attorneys, your Department of Corrections attorneys. Everybody kind of has to have an open mind, because the decision in the end is not made by the inspector. We write the investigation, and the warden and the staff attorneys will decide if there's any action warranted.
Yeah, because what you'll do is you'll send the recommendation over to the administrative staff, and then what they'll do is most likely talk to the Office of Employee Relations and try to see where they got to go from there. But again, going back to what he said, if you're covered in policy and you did everything that policy stated, then departmentally you should be good. Now we're looking at definitely, if something went wrong, definitely changes in policy, and that's where management needs to listen. I also want to talk about complacency in this all, because a lot of times, here's what I would used to do, Gary, when I was a unit, when I was a supervisor. What I would do is I would tell officers if they were new to a post, I would give them the policy and procedure and give them a chance to read it, but not while they're running the post. I know a lot of people think, oh, you know what? Here, read it, and now you got to read it while you're running the post. You can't do that. Mine doesn't work that way. You can't focus on two things at once. So I would give the person about 15, 20 minutes to read policy first, and then obviously connect them with someone who can train them. But the reason why I did that is because I want the person who's being trained to get the best of both worlds, the policy and the practice. But I also want them to take note. Does the policy run parallel with what the person that's training them is doing? Because my concern is a lot of people who become complacent may not realize that they're complacent, and now I have complacency breeding, or complacency training complacency, and now I have a facility that's so far from policy and procedure, but they don't realize that they've drifted so far apart. Have you ever had in your office, you ever had to investigate a situation where the person could have swore they followed policy and procedure, then when you give them the book to look at, they can't find it anywhere?
Well, number one, I can't believe what you just said. That's so near and dear to the whole process, and it's a necessity. You're 100% correct. Yes, I have investigated where the officers have told me, I thought I did everything exactly like I'm supposed to. And what you just said is so important. How do we make it easier for officers to follow procedures? And man, you couldn't have said it any better. We have to train. It makes us aware of our duties and helps us learn what to do in critical incidents. And you have to train your officers. You have to make it easy as a manager for your officers to follow procedures. And how do we do that? You just said it, with training. And we also have a lot of checklists in our business in corrections. Dorm logs, count sheets, security check sheets, activity logs. You know, why do we have those? Those checklists are actually helping the officers comply with policy and procedures. So you hit it right on the money. Training, checklists, make your staff aware. And staff out there, it's also your duty to read those policies and procedures also. Management makes them available. They need to train you on it. But you need to go out on your own and be aware of what's going on also.
And my concern is, hey guys, if you're out there and you kind of believe in the common practice of things, that's not going to hold up in court. You know, a lot of people believe that, well, it's always ran this way. Yeah, but policy doesn't say that, and you guys sign off acknowledging policy. So that's why you better be reading what you're signing off on, because if you're not reading it, and when it goes to court and you go to defend common practice ain't going to hold up, because the lawyers are going to have copies of policy and procedure, and they're going to want to make sure that you follow that. They could give two craps, excuse my language, about common practice at a facility. Correct, Gar?
Yes, and the lawyers, I've seen them, you know, now it could be an administrative hearing, or it could be in a court of law, in a criminal court. The lawyers are going to ask you, they're going to catch you off guard, they're going to say, tell me what this certain policy and procedure says, Officer Jones. Tell me what it says. And if you don't know, you don't have to be word for word, but if you're lost and don't know what the policy and procedure says, you're really in a world of hurt.
Right, and for management, if there's any changes that maybe there is a common practice maybe works in this, like whatever case scenario, maybe this proved that common practice does work better for this, well then you got to put a memo out there. You got to document that, you know, somewhere until you can change the policy, but that memo only holds true for so many days. So if you have a common practice that does work, you know, maybe it was discovered that this works better, then you got to solidify that with a memo and then get that policy and procedure changed within 45 days. Don't sit there and not get that done. If you don't get that done, people are going to start thinking that this works better, but when something happens, the only reference that the lawyers are going to get, or the legal system's going to get, is the last updated policy. So if you don't have a memo, or if the memo's expired, guys, you got to be able to document those practices, especially the ones that seem to work. But in the meantime, you still have to know from policy and procedure what doesn't work in order for us to implement what does work, because as mentioned before, when you go to justify your situation, you have to start off with, I know what policy is. Policy stated this. I couldn't do this, so I had to do that. And I think that opens up our ears, because we knew you knew policy, but we knew that you were acting in good intent. But at this point, there was a bit of a scramble because policy did not predict this. And for management, and Gary mentioned it before, you know, this isn't black and white. You know, policy and procedures are not black and white. They're kind of fluid. So when an officer's scrambling for something, it's very good. It's a very good idea to have their perspective at that moment. You know, see what they're going through and listen to what they have to say. If they're standing on firm ground about what policy couldn't provide for them, and this is what they had to do, then maybe you should go back and check that policy and see if there was a concern. Correct, Gary?
Correct. And management, if you do still have roll call or briefing, if you're one of the agencies that does, don't just put the new change order out on a policy and say, everybody sign this, and let it go with that. If you have time, read that policy in briefing or roll call. Usually changes aren't very long, and you can read it within 3 to 5 minutes, because just having everybody sign it at briefing and walk away, now don't know if the staff got the information or not. They should go back and read it themselves, but it would be very good for management to have it read in briefing.
Right, and guys, I also want to say something. Even when you write a report over an incident, you should definitely write in the report what policy states for you to do and what you did. I was always taught that throughout my time in corrections. Like if something happened, I would state, well, report states for me to, let's say it's a suicide watch, or not a constant watch, a close watch, and something happens in between your 15-minute observations. You should put down, well, be advised, policy stated, to make sure intermittently you see the inmate's cell every 15 minutes, so you were able to see the cell at this time and at this time, and the cause must have happened in between. At least you're documenting the fact that I know what policy stated, I followed policy, and unfortunately something still happened. So, it's good to document that, because anybody reading it, maybe in my opinion, like, oh, this person knew policy, they followed policy, so departmentally they're good. Maybe the liability would be more towards the policy itself, where maybe there's, or the procedure that brought that person to the close watch. Maybe he should have been a constant watch at that point. But either way, you did what your directive was told. You took note of it, and you also took note of the policy that you followed. And I think that works, correct, guy? When you're looking at reports, you would like to see reports that kind of start with the policy. And the reason why I'm also mentioning that too, guys, is because those reports can go into anybody's hands who won't be familiar with your policy. So if you kind of explain what the policy is and how you followed it, they start to listen to that. Correct, Gary?
That's correct, and I know some agencies will allow you to do that. Some agencies micromanage a little bit more and say, no, just put in your report what happened. I don't want you to put the policy and procedure in there. We're management. We'll worry about the policy and procedure. And I don't agree with that, because I agree with what you're saying. You should be able to put the policy and procedure in your report. That's your report. You did what you thought was correct, and now you're telling us why. And that's why I think management should not let policy and procedures drive their officers away from our career. You know, approval for every move an officer makes is not necessary. We hire adults to do a job. We swear them in as officers. So if you take away all their trust and latitude by breathing down their neck, the officers are going to be driven away because of policies and procedures, and we don't want that to happen.
Right, and guys, when you're writing a policy and procedure, the language got to be pretty much, it's supposed to be pretty much dry. There really shouldn't be any room for interpretation or subjective perspective. So if that's the case, and there are problems where people may not understand the direction of this policy, you got to start having sit down with the front line and explain that, because if you don't explain that, they're going to start interpreting it possibly in a totally opposite way that you want it to be put out there. And if that's the case and something starts happening and there's a little bit of ambiguity to what you're saying in that policy, management should be held responsible for that if that policy is not crystal clear, correct?
Correct. It's okay to talk to your staff on why a policy was created. Tell your staff why it was created. What's the purpose of the policy? Why are we using that policy? That's called communication of policies direct with your staff, and that's what your job is. Yes, you have an employee handbook, you have a policy manual, but what's good? What's one of the best things you can do? What you just mentioned. Verbal communication between management and staff, and sometimes I think we don't see enough of that.
Right, and there's another reason why you also got to know your policy and procedure, because guess who else knows it? The inmate population. Okay, yeah, they know how to abuse it. They know everything that is expected of you at your job, and if you fail to do that, they will take note of that in their grievances, and that will target somebody to look at those areas to see, did this person follow policy? So if you're not following policy, the inmates will know about it, and if there's a concern, the inmates will lead the horse to water.
Right, the inmates will write a grievance, and they have 24/7 to study the inmate handbook, actions of the officers. They watch, they listen, they hear, they see things that are done correctly, they see things that are done wrong, and they study this. You think that the inmates, well, you know, the inmates are in there for a reason. They've done some stupid things, but when they're in prison, they have 24/7 to absorb all these issues.
I just to feed along on what Gary's saying, I'm going to tell you something. This is always a word of advice for me. If an inmate asks for something, then you know that it's probably shouldn't be done. Because inmates know what's expected, you know, what they're allowed to do and what they can't do. So when they ask if they're allowed to do something, most likely they're not allowed to do it, and they're testing you to see if you know if they're allowed to do it or not. Correct, Gary?
That's exactly right. A lot of questions that inmates ask you, be aware. It may not be for their purpose. It may be to investigate you and find out exactly how much you know about your job.
Right. Hey, Gary, you know, we're coming. The show's a lot quicker now than it used to be. We got about 7 minutes left, which is cool because it targets the conversation quick and to the point. You know, there's really no room for any other discussion. But I want to ask you something. When you did a lot of investigations, most of the time when people don't follow policy and procedure, that's what also opens up to civil lawsuits. Correct?
Correct, because civil attorneys are out there like scavengers. Excuse me if there's any civil attorneys listening to this show, but they are there for a purpose. They make a living off being a civil attorney. And if they can find that someone in a government agency did not follow a policy or procedure, that is great news to a civil attorney, and they will attack.
And now, let me ask you a question. If the person does follow policy and procedure, but let's say policy and procedure should have been a little bit better than what it was, the officer is kind of off the hook now, but it's more of the department, correct? The agency?
Right, because the civil attorney will bring in the people who develop the policies and procedures, your managers and administrative policy and procedure people, and they will put them through the mill on the stand and also in deposition. And if they can't get the officer, they're going for middle management and upper management.
Now, let me ask you a question too. And you've done a lot of investigations in your time. Have you ever? I think this is kind of a corrupt action, but I know what happens when someone follows policy, gets in trouble, but he did follow or she did follow policy, and then later on, management changes that part of the policy that the person was considered in fault for.
Well, if they change the policy after an incident occurs, they better not punish the officer.
Now, have you seen that? You've seen that happen, though, correct? Because
we've seen incidents happen and occur, and that officer cannot get in trouble because the policy and procedure, as it stands, protects that officer. But after the incident, the policy and procedure is changed, and we've seen that happen a lot.
Yeah, because I see it sometimes where it gets changed, but prior to that, they already let the officer go for about 30 to 60 days. Then the officer has to fight for their job back, fight for their money back.
Oh, that also, and that's unfair. You should not let that officer go. You shouldn't punish that officer. You've got the policy and procedure in place, and that's what should be used for that incident, not something you change later.
Right, and one more thing, because we got about 4 minutes left. For supervisors that are being complacent, know for a fact, guys, that you set the standard. So if you're being complacent, my concern as management would be, well, now is my whole front line vulnerable? So now I'm going to have to wind up sending everybody back into retraining because of the power, the influence that the supervisor has. And my problem is the failure of 101. Listen, guys, we work in a correctional facility which has a lot of fail-safes. The one thing we cannot do is fail at the first level. The one thing we cannot do is fail at the first level. If we're forgetting to do the simple security things like logging stuff into a book or counting your equipment or maintaining your equipment, whatever it is, it's simple 101 stuff. That's going to make us question the other stuff. But the problem is the 101 is the entry level stuff. If we fail on that, we fail on everything. So, and if a supervisor at that point is also not doing what they're supposed to do and they're complacent in their ways, that could influence staff in a very negative way. So as management, if I start seeing supervisors being complacent and not following policy and procedure, not am I also just looking to discipline, because I'm going to be disciplining, of course I am, but I'm going to be setting a lot of people back to retraining, especially if it's simple 101. Correct, Gary?
Correct, and being a supervisor in corrections is a very tough job, so don't ever think it's not. And if you want to wear the stripes and you want to be promoted, be prepared to know your policies and procedures, because you're responsible for your shift, and you need to be able to guide your shift in the right direction.
Right, and also make sure those people sign that they read it. Because if something happens, the first thing an inspector does or an investigator does is they look at that signed sheet to see if that person knew of policy and they have it in front of them. You signed this, correct? Yes, I did. Okay, so, right?
And that becomes an exhibit. That sheet that you sign is now exhibit A1, 2, 3, or 4 in our investigative report.
And that holds a lot of weight on your case.
It sure does. I mean, that's why it's so important to stay as close to the guidelines and policy and procedures as you can. And we know that some incidents will be different, so we have to have that open mind.
And again, guys, that's why I'm giving you advice here. If you read that policy, you sign off on it, you read that policy and ask the supervisor, say, hey, listen, I know you want me to read it while I'm running a post. I just can't read it at that point. Can you give me about a 15, 20-minute break so I can take a look at what the policies are for this post, because I want to make sure I get a full understanding of what my job is. Hey, Gary, anything you want to say in closing?
I just want to stay safe. Thank you all for your service. Don't let the policies and procedures drag you down. Management, don't let the policies and procedures run your staff off. And God bless all of our road deputies and police officers out there. It's been a bad Friday night last night. So God bless those who are injured and their families.
Yes, it was. Thank you, Gary, for bringing that up. And Gary, as always, stay safe, okay?
Thank you. Take care.
Bye-bye. As you can see, I got my daughter. We're down to our last 30 seconds. You can say hi. It's fine. We're down to our last 30 seconds. Let me just shut the speaker off. This is Mia. She's a big fan of corrections, and she supports everything that we do. And we thought today would be a great show to talk about policy and procedure. This is my wife and my other daughter, Sienna. I'm doing this at the house, but again, they're very supportive of what we do.
Dad,
Yeah, say before we leave, Mia wants to say good night and send her love to all our correctional officers who risk their lives every day behind that wall. Go ahead, Mia, say I love you, correctional officers.
I love you, corrections officers.
And on that, Tier Talk is